Doctors in 1918 had never seen anything like it. It didn't kill the weak, it killed the strong. Healthy soldiers in their 20s, in the prime of their lives, would turn blue within hours and die drowning in their own blood. In just 24 months, this virus killed more people than World War I and World War II combined. More than the Black Death during its worst century. And yet, almost no one talks about it. Today, you're going to discover why the 1918 flu was the deadliest catastrophe in modern history, how the world deliberately buried it in oblivion, and exactly what turned a simple cold into a weapon capable of wiping out between 50 and 100 million lives. It is 1918. Europe has spent 4 years bleeding in the trenches of World War I. Millions of soldiers are living packed together, poorly fed, weakened, and constantly moving between continents. It is the perfect environment for a virus to spread out of control. No one knows it yet, but in this breeding ground, the deadliest pandemic ever recorded is about to emerge. It wasn't caused by a bomb. It wasn't caused by a weapon. It was caused by a chain of hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, so small that even the best microscope of the time could never have seen it. And before this video ends, you'll understand why scientists, more than 100 years later, are still studying this virus as if it were humanity's #1 threat. It all begins with a naming mistake that still persists today. We call it the Spanish flu, but Spain had nothing to do with its origin. Spain was simply the only country reporting on it freely. It was neutral in the war, its press was not censored, and when King Alfonso X became ill, Spanish newspapers reported it openly. Meanwhile, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States were hiding their own outbreaks so they wouldn't undermine the morale of their troops during the war. The result was an unfair label that followed Spain for a century, while the true origin of the virus remains the subject of scientific debate to this day. Some researchers point to a military camp in Kansas, United States, in March 1918. Others point to China, others to France. The truth is, no one knows for certain where the monster was born. We only know that once it awakened, there was no way to stop it. The first wave, in the spring of 1918, was relatively mild. Fever, sore throat, a couple of days in bed. Doctors treated it like just another seasonal flu, but the virus was mutating, and in the autumn of that same year, it returned as something completely different. Here comes the first twist in this story, one that still sends chills through epidemiologists today. Normal flu viruses kill mainly babies and the elderly. This one didn't. This one was especially brutal toward young adults between 20 and 40 years old, exactly the group that should have had the strongest immune systems. If you plot the mortality curve by age for a normal flu, it forms a U shape. The 1918 flu formed a W, with a brutal peak right in the middle of a person's life. And here comes the second twist, even more disturbing. Scientists today believe that the immune systems of those healthy young people may have been what killed them. It is called a cytokine storm. A strong body reacts so violently to the virus that the lungs fill with fluid and uncontrolled immune cells. Literally, you drown in your own biological defenses. The symptoms were terrifying even to the most experienced doctors of World War I, men who had already seen soldiers torn apart by shrapnel and mustard gas. A patient would arrive with a high fever, and within hours, the skin would begin turning a dark blue, almost black, from lack of oxygen. Doctors called it heliotrope cyanosis. Some patients died less than 24 hours after their first symptom. Military hospitals filled up so quickly that there were no beds, not enough doctors, not even enough space to store the bodies. At Camp Devens, near Boston, a doctor wrote a letter to a colleague describing how he watched dozens of young men die every day, piled up like firewood in the hallways while the bodies waited to be buried. And here we leave the first open loop in this story. If all of this was happening in 1918, why did almost no one in the world know about it until it was too late? The answer may surprise you, and it comes later. The war was the virus's perfect ally. Ships packed with soldiers were constantly crossing the Atlantic. Military trains traveled from one end of Europe to the other, and every one of those movements was an opportunity for the virus to jump from body to body, country to country, continent to continent. Within just a few months, the 1918 flu reached India, China, South Africa, Brazil, Alaska, and the most remote islands of the Pacific. Not a single inhabited corner of the planet escaped it. In Philadelphia, United States, authorities made one of the most tragic mistakes of the entire pandemic. In late September 1918, with the virus already actively circulating through the city, they decided to go ahead with a massive parade to sell war bonds. More than 200,000 people packed shoulder to shoulder into the streets. 10 days later, the city was overwhelmed. Bodies piled up on the sidewalks because there were not enough coffins or gravediggers. Mechanical shovels had to be used to dig mass graves. In just 6 weeks, Philadelphia lost more than 12,000 people. But if you think Philadelphia was the worst of it, wait. Because the true horror of this pandemic did not take place in major Western cities with hospitals, doctors, and at least some healthcare infrastructure. It happened in communities that had never been exposed to this kind of virus. Imagine a remote village in Alaska, on the coast of the Bering Strait, an isolated Inuit community with no previous immunity to any similar influenza virus. When the disease arrived in November 1918, it killed so quickly that in some villages, 90% of the adults died within days. There were entire communities where only the children survived, left orphaned, surrounded by bodies, with no one to care for them, in the middle of the Arctic winter. On the island of Western Samoa, then under New Zealand administration, a ship carrying infected passengers was allowed to dock without any kind of quarantine. In just 2 months, 20% of the entire island's population died, 20 out of every 100 people. Meanwhile, in neighboring American Samoa, authorities imposed a strict quarantine, and there were virtually no deaths. 2 islands, the same pandemic, 2 different decisions, 2 completely opposite outcomes. And now we reach the heart of this story, the moment when the entire planet was, without realizing it, at the peak of the deadliest catastrophe ever recorded. Between October and November 1918, while Europe celebrated the end of World War I, the pandemic was reaching its most lethal point in human history. Think about this. World War I, 4 years of trenches, mustard gas, and machine guns claimed around 17 million lives. World War II, 6 years of bombs, concentration camps, and atomic weapons claimed around 75 million. Add them together. That is roughly 92 million deaths across 2 of the bloodiest wars in human history, spread over an entire decade. The 1918 flu killed, according to the estimates most widely accepted by the scientific community today, between 50 and 100 million people, in just 2 years. Some recent studies place the figure even higher. In other words, an invisible virus, with no armies, no bombs, and no borders to respect, may have killed as many people as, or even more than, the 2 largest conflicts in modern history combined. And it did so in a fraction of the time. India alone lost between 12 and 20 million people, more than any other country in the world, an enormous percentage of its entire population at the time. How is it possible that something so devastating was almost erased from collective memory, while wars are taught in schools across the entire planet? Here we close the first open loop. The answer has to do with the very nature of what happened. A war has sides, heroes, villains, battles with names and dates, peace treaties to sign. A pandemic has none of that. There is no enemy to point a finger at, no victory to celebrate, no treaty that officially brings the suffering to an end. On top of that, the world was emerging exhausted from 4 years of war and desperately wanted to move on. No one wanted to keep talking about death. Governments, embarrassed by their failure to control the pandemic, preferred to minimize it in official history books. And so, a catastrophe potentially deadlier than 2 world wars combined was reduced to a footnote in most school textbooks. The pandemic did not end all at once. A third wave arrived in early 1919, somewhat less lethal than the second, but still devastating. And here comes the second scientific twist in this story. The virus did not disappear because humanity defeated it with vaccines or treatments, because in 1918 there were no medical tools capable of fighting it. It disappeared, to a large extent, because it evolved into a less lethal form. From the purely biological perspective of a virus, killing your host too quickly is not a smart strategy. A dead body cannot continue infecting anyone else. Over time, the less aggressive strains, the ones that allowed infected people to keep moving, coughing, and spreading the virus for longer, became dominant. The virus, quite literally, domesticated itself in order to survive. That same viral lineage, in much milder forms, still circulates among us today, hidden within the common seasonal flu viruses that leave us in bed for a couple of days every winter. The impact of the 1918 flu went far beyond the death toll. It changed entire societies. In many countries, life expectancy plummeted during those 2 years, a collapse that would not be repeated until decades later during other catastrophes. Thousands of children were suddenly orphaned. Local economies collapsed because there were not enough healthy workers to tend the fields, keep factories running, or even bury the dead with dignity. In some regions, mass graves had to be dug using heavy machinery, something that until then had only been seen on the worst battlefronts of war. And yet, barely a century later, when another global pandemic arrived in 2020, many governments around the world had to rediscover, almost from scratch, lessons that had already been learned and forgotten in 1918. The importance of early quarantine, the danger of mass gatherings, the need to tell the public the truth instead of hiding it out of fear of social reaction. The story of Samoa, with 2 neighboring islands and 2 radically different outcomes depending on their public health decisions, played out again in different forms, city by city, a century later. The 1918 flu leaves us with an uncomfortable lesson that many people would rather not confront. Humanity did not need armies, invaded borders, or bombs falling from the sky to suffer one of its greatest catastrophes. All it took was a microscopic virus, overcrowded trenches, and the refusal of several governments to tell the truth in time. 50 to 100 million people died in just 2 years, more than in the 2 world wars combined, and yet most people today know more about the battles of Verdun or Stalingrad than they do about this silent pandemic that swept across the entire planet. Perhaps the next time someone dismisses a health crisis as something distant or exaggerated, it is worth remembering what happened just over a century ago, when the deadliest enemy in history wore no uniform, carried no flag, and bore no country's name. If this story has changed the way you think about what could truly bring humanity to its knees, subscribe to the channel, because every week we uncover another catastrophe that official history preferred to forget.